Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Ed Gereggian. I'm the founding director of the Baker Institute, and I want to warmly welcome you all here to our institute and to Rice University. We meet today at a pivotal time for the U.S. oil industry. The explosion on the Deepwater Horizon rig in April of 2010 led to the largest oil spill in United States history. The spill threatened Gulf of Mexico ecosystems, the local Gulf Coast economy, and the future of U.S. offshore drilling. Attempts to control the blowout captivated the public for over 2 months, and the oil industry is now firmly focused on the response from Washington, which will affect offshore drilling, we believe, for years to come. Nevertheless, change should be constructive and sustainable, and the purpose of today's program is to raise the level of debate on this timely and important policy subject. Right now, we believe that the United States would benefit from greater and more detailed discussion on the options to address offshore drilling challenges. United States regulatory policy lags other nations in the resources and time devoted to offshore rig inspection and oversight. It also differs in approach from other countries that require a comprehensive safety risk assessment process as part of the regulatory structure. These differences and other scientific and technical factors need to be fully debated in forging a solid policy for the future. The contribution of global offshore deepwater oil production to the world oil balance, I think you'll all agree with me, has been nothing short of extraordinary. From virtually zero in the 1980s, global deepwater oil output climbed to 5 million barrels a day in 2009. Today, deepwater activity accounts for the majority of new conventional oil production. And the International Energy Agency, the IEA, projects that deepwater production will increase to 9 million barrels a day by 2035, or to almost 50% of world offshore oil production, up from about 1/3 currently. Our goal for today's deliberations is to give the public more confidence about the pathways available to create a safer, successful United States oil sector. The public strongly responded to the spill and now demands that appropriate changes limit the likelihood of future incidents. Public polling by the Gallup organization found that the percentage of Americans who thought the environment should be given priority, even at the risk of limiting energy supplies, rose quickly from 43% in March of 2010 to 55% in May during the midst of the spill. The most recent January 2011 Gallup poll, however, shows that a majority of Americans, I find this equally interesting, 65%, favor expanding drilling and exploration for oil and natural gas. The federal government has taken concrete steps, many controversial, since April. These have included a temporary moratorium and the creation of 2 new agencies out of the former Minerals Management Service. We are pleased to have as our luncheon keynote speaker Michael Bromwich, the director of the new regulatory agency overseeing offshore drilling, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulation, and Enforcement. I love those government titles. Recently, in mid-January, the National Commission on the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill issued its final report on the spill's causes and its recommendations for future government and industry policy, and I'm sure most of you have read that. Throughout the day, I expect our distinguished speakers and panelists will refer to this report while providing their own thoughts and analysis. Today's discussion, we expect, will be broad, including the impact of the spill on the ecology of the Gulf and the policies, practices, and technologies needed to encourage safe production of offshore oil. We are truly delighted that top industry leaders, policy analysts, and scientists are here with us to share their views on these major topics. We look forward to an engaging discussion with the important energy and environmental leaders and analysts here. We would like to acknowledge the assistance offered by our own Rice University faculty in putting together the diverse agenda for today's forum. In particular, our deep appreciation is extended to Rice University faculty and Baker Institute fellows George Hirosaki, Jim Tour, Ron Sass, Amy Jaffe, and Ken Medlock for their work, their hard work really, on today's program. Now I would like to introduce very briefly, he is well known to you, our keynote speaker this morning, Robin West. He is chairman of the board, founder, and CEO of PFC Energy. As founder and chairman, he has gained a unique perspective on the international energy industry. Before founding PFC Energy in 1984, he served in the Reagan administration as Assistant Secretary of the Interior for Policy, Budget, and Administration, with responsibility for U.S. offshore oil policy. We are truly delighted to partner with PFC Energy to co-host today's event. Robin, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Ed. I will move along briskly. We have a big program today. PFC Energy is delighted to join with the Baker Center in this project, in this conference, which we hope will be the beginning of a constructive dialogue. And when Amy Jaffe, who runs the Energy Forum, and I first talked, the idea was to find a way to move forward, to create a constructive dialogue with serious players, and to look forward, not backwards. There's enough has been said in the past. How do we go forward? A commentator for MSNBC likes to say, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts. And this program has people certainly with different opinions, which is healthy in a debate of this importance to the country, as Ed pointed out. But you have to get the facts too. And this is critical when decisions are being made on issues of this importance. My purpose today is to focus on some facts which I think have been largely ignored in the debate, and which should be a factor in policy and political decisions. Again, for the purposes of my presentation, we're using forward projections, and we want to examine what is at stake, and we'd say there's a lot at stake. By the way, there's a small white paper which is on the desk outside. If any of you haven't gotten it, please pick one up on the way out. So I'm going to talk about what's at stake, and basically, to summarize my talk, is a lot. Okay. The Gulf, and particularly the deep water, a couple points. The Gulf, and particularly the deep water, is an essential contributor to U.S. energy security. I want to explain a little bit how the Gulf works, its phases and players. The offshore industry is a major force in the national economy and employment beyond the Gulf Coast, which I think is important to remember. And deepwater E&P is crucial to meeting global energy demands, not just in the U.S. Now, we in the United States produce about 40% of our energy, and 60% is imported. These patterns are changing. We're taking less now from the Middle East, and we're taking more from the Atlantic Basin, places like West Africa and Brazil, which I should point out are deep water plays. And so the deep water is important to U.S. energy security, not just U.S. deep water, but global deep water. One of the things you see is that, obviously, and this is much discussed, there is a growing long-term dependency, but here it's tipped down. And that's a couple of reasons for that. The first is obviously the slower economy and lower demand, but also less products are being imported here. But the other thing is here, and that is we're producing more in the U.S., and as you'll see, a lot of that's coming from the offshore. Now, these were our projections looking at the deep water in considerable detail. And basically, if you look at onshore U.S., Alaska, and the shallow water, they're all declining. But you'll see that here, and these were our projections before the spill, you can see that the deep water is playing a increasingly important part. But we also believe that this is going to be impacted by regulatory changes. Now, we showed that by, again, forward-looking projections, because that's really what we're talking about here, by 2020, PFC Energy's base case projected that about 2.5 million of the U.S. forecast production, that 2.1 would come from the Gulf of Mexico. 81% would be coming from deep and ultra-deep waters. In the Gulf of Mexico, we're estimating by 2020, about 19% comes from shallow water, about 45% would come from deep, and about 36% would come from ultra-deep. So this is a big part of our oil mix. Now, in comparison, in 2000, 2/3 of all Gulf of Mexico production came from shallow water. So this is a huge transition, a huge shift in the industry. Now, the industry has evolved over time, and my friend Carol Dinkins, who is here, and I were actively involved at one point. The first well was drilled by Kerr McGee out of sight of land in 18 feet of water in 1947. In the 1970s to the present, there's been activity in the Pliocene and Upper Miocene, which is greater than 1,000-foot water depths. In the early 80s, when I was involved, as Ed pointed out, we created the second 5-year plan, which created area-wide leasing, which permitted companies to really change their strategy and to identify real plays and structures they hadn't had an opportunity to do before. And then in the late, really beginning at the turn of the century, in about 2000, there was increased exploration success in the lower tertiary, greater than 5,000-foot water depths. So there are really 3 phases to the development of the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things that's important to recognize is that there's really a relatively small number of companies do the early exploration. And you can see here that Shell has been extremely active. BP has been extremely active. Chevron up here has been active. Shell has also been active. But there are a number of companies that have led the way in the deep water. This is a very capital intensive. It's one of the most technologically sophisticated industries on Earth, of any industry, not just the oil industry. The scale and complexity of this really can only be undertaken by big companies at the real exploration, frontier exploration stage. But over time, you can see a wider group of companies enter to develop the play. And the base is broadening. As you can see here, here's BP, Chevron, and Royal Dutch Shell. Then you go to the next level here. One of the points I'd point out to come later is a number of these companies here. This is Statoil, Petrobras, Eni, Total, BHP from Australia. The point is that they're international players coming into the Gulf of Mexico. Capital is fungible in this business. Money can flow into the Gulf of Mexico, and one of my points is money can flow out of the Gulf of Mexico. Now, one of the things also is that the Gulf of Mexico is an extraordinarily active, and frankly, it's been developed very efficiently from an economic standpoint. You can see the extraordinary level of activity inshore, and as I say, that was the early phases moving offshore. And what's happened is that you can see there have been 47,000 exploration development wells drilled in the shallow water and on the shelf, nearly 3,000 platforms installed, and over 200 operators. This is mature and it's gas prone. This is an area where a lot of the independents are very active, and many of the majors have basically exited the shelf. The independents play an important role in the Gulf for 2 reasons. One is that they have lower thresholds, so that a smaller discovery would be material for them, which might not be material for a big company. And likewise, particularly on the shelf, when the fields tend to mature and their cost structure is lower, and they can take over and manage fields more efficiently. So it's a very efficient system between big companies and smaller companies. The other thing about the Gulf is that it's been developed very systematically, and there's a tremendous infrastructure of pipelines, and it permits relatively small fields, satellite fields, to be developed. And again, this is unique in West Africa and other places. To a certain extent, this is true in the North Sea, but nothing to the extent of the Gulf of Mexico. One of the things, again, is that there are a lot of companies involved here. Again, they're the big ones, but then you go out here. And so as you look at policy, it's very important to remember that this affects a lot of small companies, some which are very active and very aggressive and very imaginative. And they are also important, frankly, employers for the service sector. Now, one of the questions I think that is not well understood is, what is the impact of the offshore industry on the economy? And this is a busy chart. You can see that there are thousands of products and services support the offshore industry in the Gulf of Mexico and globally. And everyone thinks that this is an industry basically of a bunch of good old boys along the Gulf Coast. Well, it is an industry of good old boys on the Gulf Coast. But also, as I like to point out, this is, the offshore industry is the largest purchaser of helicopters after the Defense Department. These helicopters are not built in Baton Rouge. They are built in places like suburban Philadelphia and Connecticut. One of the largest compressor plants in America, which is used a lot offshore, is in South Carolina. You have equipment that comes from all over. And so this is a big, complex national industry. The U.S. Gulf of Mexico is a driver of the global offshore technology and services industry. The Gulf of Mexico offshore is a $60 billion direct economic driver for the Gulf Coast region and the nation, estimating about $26 billion in annual capital expenditures, about $5 billion in annual operating expenditures, and $28 billion in revenues, leases, royalties, and taxes. That's a lot of money. And there's an estimated 400,000 to 500,000 jobs are related in the Gulf of Mexico to the offshore oil and gas industry. And as you can see, the drilling industry alone, you saw that complicated chart. Drilling alone is about 63,000 jobs on the Gulf Coast, and about a quarter of that's right here in Harris County. One report, in a worst-case scenario, said the Gulf Coast, if there was a long-term production stoppage, it could cost 285,000 jobs. So this is a big industry. It's a capital-intensive industry. One of the mistakes made is people say, well, there are not many people employed by the oil companies. So that's true. But oil companies spend a lot of money. They buy a lot of stuff. And somebody's got to make that stuff. And that's really where a lot of the economic impact of this industry comes. Now, one of the things also is that this is a global industry, as Ed Derigian pointed out. And this is our post-Macondo forecast. We're now saying that the Gulf of Mexico will only be about 12% of global capex. Before the spill, we were estimating that it would be about 17% of global capex, and for the period 2011 to 2020. We believe that the U.S. has already lost about 5% of the future pie, which equates to about $100 billion between now and 2020. One of the important things is capital is going to flow to the deep water, whether it flows to the Gulf of Mexico or elsewhere. Money's going to flow into this sector, but this is a global industry. And if it does go elsewhere, the cost in jobs and energy security is going to be enormous. Now, we have an estimate here. You're looking at, this is pre-Macondo. This is our base forecast. And then this is if there's a production slowdown of 10% or a production slowdown of 15%. And if you take the 10% case of cumulative production from 2011 to 2020, there'll be 23% fewer wells over the decade. And if it's 15%, there'll be 37% fewer wells. That means that our base case is 100 wells in 2020. The post-Macondo cases could be down to 75 or 65 wells. And again, the economic impact in terms of imported oil is enormous. If it's 10% reduction, it means 100 million barrels a year less, or more will have to be imported. And that's figure something in the order of 8 billion. And if it's down 15%, that'll be 12 billion. These are big ticket items. Now, one of the questions is, why is the deep water so important to giant companies like Chevron and Shell and BP? Well, the reason is, partly, is access. And you can see here, this is a pie chart PFC created a long time ago. And you can see that the national oil companies here, this is national oil company reserves with no equity access. That means the international oil companies can't get in at all. That's places like Saudi Arabia. And then you go to national oil companies with equity access. What happens is that if you look at total oil and gas, you'll see that the national oil companies control about almost 80% of the resources. The industry, this is the North Sea, Australia, Canada, the US, and a few other places, where there's full IOC access. It's 7% of the pie. It's a tiny wedge. So there's intense competition to try and find reserves elsewhere. If you go offshore, you can see generally it's offshore that there's equity access here, which is 26%. But when you go into the deep water, you can see that there's equity access. This is places like West Africa. There's equity access is 59%. This is a huge opportunity set for the industry. And so again, as I say, the industry is going to invest in deep water. They're going to invest in deep water in the Gulf of Mexico, and if they don't do it in the Gulf of Mexico, they're going to go somewhere else. Now, this chart is very simple. What it just shows is basically that the United States is the most developed province, the Gulf of Mexico, but Brazil is the most prospective. And it's not an accident that some rigs are leaving the Gulf to go to Brazil today. So in conclusion, the Gulf of Mexico deep water and ultra deep water can contribute about 1/3 of domestic oil production by 2020, provided there are no significant reductions or delays compared with pre-Macondo. Secondly, companies of all size and interests are crucial to the efficiency of the system. This isn't just a big company play. Independents have a role in all of this. Globally, deep water provides almost 10% of production, and the share is growing as mature sources decline. And the industry is going to push this because this is one of the few outlets they have that is of scale. And the U.S. is one of the leading deep water countries. Regulatory decisions made in the U.S. will have a potent impact on the future of the global energy supply. And finally, the deepwater industry is global, and it's going to take its capital, equipment, and jobs to other basins if it cannot operate in the U.S. So in conclusion, what is at stake? My answer would be a lot. Thank you.
Despite Robin's illustrious service in the government, he started on time, he ended on time, he got a balanced budget. Bravo. Thank you, Robin. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. G. Paul Kemp, Vice President of the National Audubon Society's Louisiana Coastal Initiative. An oceanographer and coastal geologist, he has an extensive background in coastal restoration and policy, and he plays a key role in Audubon's larger conservation efforts along the Mississippi River. He has also served as a National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Fellow on the staff of the late Senator Edward Kennedy. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Kemp to the program.
And it is a great privilege to be here sharing the podium in such an important forum, and I'm very eager to see what we can do in terms of moving forward, and I just want to make sure that we're not forgetting last summer. So, but it is only going to be with all of us working together that we actually do get a chance to do that. And I want to remind you of Audubon. It's been around a long time. We speak for the birds. We're saving the planet one bird at a time. But we're working in the Gulf Coast with other national organizations, particularly the Environmental Defense Fund and the National Wildlife Federation. And we're doing that in a way that really we haven't collaborated before. And I think one of the things that has happened with the Macondo blowout is the coalescing of the environmental community around the need to work together. I guess we are in the business of, I guess, like the industry. You're looking at prospects, you're looking at envisioning a future. We are also, we're trying to catalyze action to make sure that future is better for the environment than it has been, and we're trying to create an environment in which it's acceptable to plan ahead. Really, we are my experience is a lot in coastal Louisiana. That's not a place where we're known for planning ahead that much. But I want to suggest also that, like the industry is global, the Gulf of Mexico, the Mississippi River Delta, these are also global assets. They're important on the global scale. And from an Audubon standpoint, we tend to look a lot at birds, but the Mississippi River Delta is certainly a key focal area for birds moving hemispherically north and south. And in Louisiana, we have identified about a third of the state as being critically important on either a global or continental level to a number of species of concerns, bird species of concern. Here's, I have to give one nice picture of bird, and this is the swamp canary or prothonotary warbler. One thing we have in Louisiana is perhaps not a huge number of rare and endangered species, but vast assemblages of congregations of species. In this case, the prothonotary warbler, the criteria for global importance is something like 18,000 breeding pairs. In one swamp near New Orleans, we have over 200,000. So we have these huge congregations. And what we're finding out from the science is that when we do put a little direction locators on these birds, we find more and more of them are passing through the Mississippi River Delta and that flyway up and down the Mississippi Valley. It's a very important route for them. And of course, this route is also very, very important for a lot of other industries and economic sectors, transportation, and of course oil and gas and the distribution systems. It's interesting to contrast the way the Mississippi Valley brings water together and passes it out through the northern Gulf, and then the way gas and oil is collected and distributed. This is a node of a very important distribution system for many, many products as well as nature. And of course, it's also a place where we are looking at moving ahead, but we still have a lot of reminders of the past around us. One of them is, nearly 10,000 miles of oil field access canals and pipeline canals. And we also, it's not just the oil industry. Here's a navigation project where that ended up causing a lot of flooding in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina. So there's a tendency for these channels to expand over time. And we also have just sea level rise subsidence. We get this kind of Swiss cheese effect. This is probably the largest contributor to coastal land loss in Louisiana, is just the fact that we're not resupplying sediment through the river to the coastal wetlands. So this is the backdrop against which we have the events of last summer, and we have this detailed analysis of how the delta has changed, and it's changed so that people, this is not a change that people don't notice. This is a change that happens in a matter of decades. And so this is we see 44 square kilometers converted to open water every year. The red areas are all areas that have been lost since the 30s. The green is the only areas of building there around the Chapalaya in this area. So this is a system that's actually in an advanced state of ecosystem collapse. And so, and the approach has always been, if it breaks, then we'll fix it, And that was certainly the approach to New Orleans, where perhaps $1 billion well spent could have prevented $100 billion worth of damage. In this case, we're now spending $15 billion to get somewhere close to a 100-year protection level. So this is this is the tradition and the history in the area, and the disasters keep coming. We're We're going to see, of course, we've got the wetland loss. That's the predicate for a lot of things. It makes the ecosystem setup very unforgiving. And then we have the Mississippi Delta retreating back onto the shelf. This is for the geologists here, the last shelf edge delta in the northern Gulf. And then when we look at the blowout response, what we saw in this summer was that capacity had been allowed to atrophy. So what we want to make sure is that we hear this wake-up call, and to take better care of our seas and coasts, and even whether those rigs go to Brazil or Africa, those are also places of importance from an ecosystem standpoint. And so we want to make sure that technology for containment is there for them. It's now clear, I think, to everyone that what starts on the outer continental shelf or in the ultra deep water doesn't necessarily stay there. There is a connection to our coast. And as we look down the road, we have to remember that while we move forward, we're also connected to a legacy of the past. And that has to be part of the calculation moving forward. And I would suggest it can be a proactive part of that. Both the MABUS and the Presidential Commission have called for about 80% of any penalties, Clean Water Act penalties resulting from the Macondo spill, to be put it back into trying to repair the coastal ecosystem in the Mississippi River Delta. It is important that the natural resource damage assessment be allowed to run its course so that we actually know what whether good, bad, we know what the effects of this remarkable event are. And I just want to say, we're at National Audubon, we're very interested. We understand that oil and gas is important to our economy and to the world, and so is the environment. And we're committed to trying to work together to come up with some good steps forward. And when we're talking about managing risk, we want to make sure we understand those risks and that we have the systems in place to manage them. And that if that requires a brief pause to assess that, we understand that that's necessary. And when that is, it is clear that we have some ways of addressing containment from deep, ultra deep blowouts, then we're with you very much to move forward and safely recover these resources. So thank you very much for having me today, and I look forward to a very interesting discussion for the rest of the day. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Ronald Sass. I'm the Climate Change Fellow at the Baker Institute, and it's my privilege to welcome you this morning to the first session and to keep time so that people finish on time. So far, so good, but I hadn't had anything to do about that. We have 4 people who are speaking in this session. Dr. Alan Thornhill, Commissioner Jerry Patterson, myself, and Professor Linda Bowie. Now, we will start with Alan Thornhill. And Alan is well, all of these biographies are in your program, so I won't dwell on much, but I would like to say that Alan is currently the science advisor to the director for the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, Regulations, and Enforcement. A term we chuckled over before. On the other hand, he was, prior to that, from 2001 to 2010, the executive director of the Society for Conservation Biology, which had the impressive list of 12,000 members. So he has considerable experience in managing large numbers of people, or at least interacting with them. On the other hand, prior to that, Alan was here at Rice University as a faculty member. And we became very good friends at that time because he was in my department. He didn't stay very long. I had always characterized him as a young, hard charger. And he's still charging hard, but he's hardly young anymore. So it's my pleasure to introduce Alan Thornhill.
Good morning. Well, it's a real pleasure to be back here at Rice. Thank you for inviting me to participate and get myself organized here a little bit. A couple of things I want to hold up and show you at some point if the mood strikes me. It's actually appropriate that I follow Dr. Kemp, and his talk gives me a wonderful segue into the things that I wanted to speak about. Knowing my background as a conservation biologist, having worked in conservation for most of my career, you can probably expect that I'm not going to talk a lot about regulation and enforcement of offshore drilling activities, but rather the backdrop, the context, and the matrix that all of these things out in the Gulf operate within. And so it's appropriate that we start with a panel on ecology for today's overall discussion. Some people may raise an eyebrow at the idea that ecology is the basis and the context for everything that we do out in the Gulf or anywhere else for that matter. And it's a relatively new idea for some people who have never really thought much about ecology. And in fact, if I go back 15 years or so to when I was faculty here at Rice University, and even teaching at another university before that, it was often the case that I found that there was very little dialogue about the thing that I cared most about, which is the linkage between human health, economic health, and ecological health. And 15, 20 years ago when I started teaching, I felt like the lone wolf shouting about these linkages and these connections, and people just sort of cocked their head sideways and said, but ecology is out there somewhere. It's not really relevant, is it? I mean, it does its thing, we do our thing. And I think that's changing, and people are beginning to realize and recognize that ecology isn't out there at all. Ecology is us. Ecology is the air we're breathing right now, the water that made the coffee out in the lobby. If we're going to have healthy humans and a healthy economy, we have to have that healthy ecological system as well. That's the basis of all of these things that we're talking about. Does that sound like the government speaking? Again, my background as a conservation biologist is one of the reasons why I was brought in at the time that I was, 6 weeks before the Macondo well event, into the government, having left my job that was stable and very comfortable working with my colleagues that I had developed long-term relationships with. I saw this challenge and this opportunity of this specific point in time where I felt like we could actually look forward and we could actually think about resource extraction in a way that integrated human, ecological, and economic health all at the same time. So that was the opportunity that I saw. And Dr. Kemp's mention of the opportunity of this crisis is something that I want to talk about a little bit today. It's often these dramatic events that help us to refocus our attention on the things that are really very important. A lot of times we take for granted the things that are basic and sustainable for our well-being. And a crisis can help refocus our thoughts and our attention on the things that we need to get right, because all things that follow from that will have a better chance of being right if we get the foundations right. So looking at the Macondo event as an opportunity, as a way of looking forward, was one of the reasons why I said yes when we got this invitation to speak, and I was able to talk in the ecology section. So in my 15 or 20 years of teaching in undergraduate and graduate institutions, I always start my course with a question that helps me to gauge the atmosphere of the group and the background of the group, and it goes something like this. What is one piece of evidence that humans and human systems are independent of the biological systems that operate on the planet? One piece of evidence. That's all I want. 15 or 20 years ago, people struggled very hard to come up with the one piece of evidence, but they usually came up with something that they felt was a compelling reason that they could point to and say, we are independent of the biological rules of the world because of this. But more recently, I'm finding that students are asking me if it's a trick question. They're asking me if, in fact, is there a piece of evidence? If there is, can you share it with me? Because I think that's important. I should know that, but I don't know what that is. And this groundswell shift that I've seen over the past 15 years, I think, is evident of a wider shift in people's understanding of the world around us. People are a lot more savvy when they come into my class at the beginning of the semester. I have to work a little harder to stay ahead of them because they already know the basic ecology. They already understand this stuff. And when you hear that 43%, or an increase to 43% of the public think that ecology should be a central focus of our understanding and our protection in the Gulf of Mexico relative to some much lower number before the disaster, indicates that the public is also much more aware of this than they used to be. And again, these events help to focus our attention on that. So what I want to really speak about for just a few minutes is, if I can get my slide to advance, there we go, is not about the Presidential Commission report, but instead I want to talk about the Mabus report, where Secretary Ray Mabus was charged with putting together a plan for how to restore the Gulf Coast. And so if you haven't seen this report, you should take a look at it, and we are very fortunate to have had a great number of very smart and forward-looking people that helped the Secretary Mabus to come up with a plan that actually does provide us with a way forward. We know some of these things already. We heard this in an earlier talk about the amount of revenue and income generation and economic activity that results from offshore oil drilling. There's no doubt that it's an important component of our economy and that it must, in a safe and sustainable way, be part of the future. But there's other components we need to think about. The spill has identified the fact that there are significant ecosystem impacts from oil in the water. Business is affected, health is affected, home prices decrease. But what's most important is that this reminded us that this isn't the first time that the Gulf has suffered a body blow. It's been under attack for decades. And we need to step back and ask the question, are we actually setting ourselves up for bigger disasters in the future, ecological disasters in the future, that we could, as Dr. Kemp mentioned, invest a little bit now and protect ourselves from massive investments in the future? In the Mabus report, there's the explicit mandate to consider health, economy, and ecosystems simultaneously. There's a recognition that these are linked systems, human ecological linked systems that can't be thought of as independent units that don't affect and interact with each other. And that's a significant move forward. The task force that's being assembled right now as a result of the Mabus report is focusing on engaging stakeholders, working with affected tribes, affected states, coordinating all of these efforts, and really looking for the sort of best of breed of all of the restoration projects that are out there that have been developed by Audubon, by others, and pulling together all of the smart, capable people that have been thinking about these issues for, in some cases, decades, and figuring out how do we move forward in a way that is actually a sustainable, supportive situation in the Gulf for human health, for economic health, and for ecological health. The big challenge that we have, and I should mention that I'm actually part of the Department of Interior's representation to the task force. And so I'm right in the middle of Department of Interior's part of this effort. And it's great to be there, and it's great to have the opportunity to represent the conservation background that I bring into the mix with all of my colleagues at Interior. But the key here is the coordination of the stakeholders, the coordination of the multiple efforts that are underway within the Gulf right now, and that includes the regulation changes that my bureau are putting into place that will change the shape of the way offshore oil drilling is done in the future. And you'll hear about that more when my director is here for lunch to talk to you about the changes that are being made within our department. And so I won't go into those details right now, but instead want to speak a little bit about a topic that a couple of my colleagues at Interior, Dr. Mackless and Dr. McNutt from Park Service and USGS respectively, advanced in Science magazine very recently. They pointed out that there's a significant urgency in ramping up the restoration efforts in the Gulf. On the heels of this disaster, on the heels of the activity that this disaster brought, there's the potential. I'm going to zoom in on that graph a little bit. That green wedge in the middle, you'll notice that time is along the bottom axis, and investment in response is on the vertical axis, and the stress on the system is the purple line that's running across the graph there. In an emergency event, the stress on the system increases rapidly, but so does the response to that event. And so the amount of money, the amount of people involved increases very rapidly to deal with a crisis situation. But when the crisis is contained, there's the potential that all of those resources and all that attention wanes and all those people go back to their job. And then we start thinking about, well, we really should be doing something about the restoration of this area, and we really need to be thinking about protecting it from damage in the future. So we probably ought to ramp up a restoration effort and really think about how we reconstruct the system so that it's more resilient and more healthy and able to withstand these perturbations that come their way. And there'll always be perturbations, whether it's oil spills or hurricanes or combinations of those things. They're always going to be there. We have to recognize that. That's part of the ecological and economic coupled systems. So we need to manage for those things. We need to think about how to make the system resilient enough to be able to bounce back from those things. And of course, we need to mitigate so that we can reduce the amount of impact that the system has to suffer from. But there's that wedge in there, and that wedge really concerns me. And Dr. Mackless and I had long conversations about how do we prevent that wedge from being as large as it has been after some other disasters. That wedge is the lag time between the ramp up for the emergency and the ramp up for the restoration. And so that's one of the reasons why we have a very short fuse on this restoration task force, is because we recognize that the bigger that wedge is, the less likely it is that we're going to have the attention and the resources we need to actually do something meaningful in the Gulf. So it behooves us all to keep this stuff in the news and to keep talking about it and to keep working on it, because it helps us to keep attention focused, and it'll help us to keep the resources focused on the job at hand, which is the restoration and the rebuilding of the Gulf Coast into a resilient system that can actually handle the things that we keep throwing at it. So that's the urgency that we've set for ourselves. This task at hand is quite a big one, but we do have this window of opportunity to really do some good. I heard Major General Walsh, who's the commander of the Mississippi Valley Division of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, speak a few weeks ago about his vision for what the entire Mississippi Valley could do for restoration of the Gulf. I mean, this is an area that covers 12 states, some 370,000 square miles that he's responsible for. And when he talks about the restoration of the Gulf Coast, he talks about getting the farmers in Iowa involved. That's his vision for dealing with restoration. It's huge and it's long term. And he recognizes that what happens at the headwaters of the Mississippi affects the Gulf Coast. And that's the kind of big vision, big landscape thinking that we need if we're going to make headway in dealing with the restoration and the reconstruction of the system that supports all the life in the Gulf Coast. The fishermen, the human health, the oil production, all of it requires that these foundations be solid. So look forward to the Restoration Task Force activities. Find a way to engage if you can. It requires a lot of thinking and a lot of effort from a lot more people than just the ones that the federal government can throw at it. So we need your help, and we look forward to working with you, and I'll quit there and leave time for questions at the end. Thanks for your attention.
As Dr. Thornhill mentioned, questions at the end. What we would like to do is go through the program, and then at the end, you can ask your questions to whomever you wish to from the speaker. Our next speaker, who fortunately just arrived, is Commissioner Jerry Patterson, a thoroughgoing Texan, born in Houston, educated at Texas A&M, which I'm not. My son was at A&M, and I told him I'd admit him to Rice if he promised not to come here. So, but nevertheless, and at that same time, you got your commission in the Marine Corps, which you served for a while, came back to Texas, became our representative from this district to the state legislature, and then in 2002 became the 27th commissioner, land commissioner of the state of Texas. Now, those of you who aren't particularly familiar with Texas government, the Texas Land Office is the oldest agency in Texas, and also I think the only agency that actually raises money and pays for itself, and even has a surplus, which goes, I believe, into the education fund. They're in charge of several things: mineral rights, for example, management of state properties, archiving all the records and maps of Houston, going all the way back to the beginning, to the founding of the Republic. But one of its responsibilities is to protect the Texas Gulf Coast, and that includes oil spill prevention and oil spill response programs. So I'm rather interested in what that particular group is going to be doing, and therefore I give to you Jerry Patterson.
And good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to visit with you all this morning. I just made it in from Austin by about a two-minute window to spare. It's kind of hard getting out of town there now. There's such a vacuum at present that it kind of makes it slow progress coming out. I'm going to talk a little bit about the General Land Office, how we have jurisdictional, how we are the essentially custodian of the Texas coast, a little historical perspective of how that happened, something about our responsibility in the oil spill prevention and response at the Texas General Land Office. But let me just start out by saying, you know, I'm your speaker this morning. My job is to speak, and your job is to listen. But if you get finished before I do, feel free to leave the hall. You know, the legislature's in session, and a lot of folks lament that fact. And, you know, if you read the newspapers, you know it's going to be a very tough session, and folks are continually accusing those guys up there of being idiots. And I submit that if the Texas legislature didn't have a few idiots, it would not be a representative body. The Texas General Land Office is the oldest agency in Texas. We've been around since 1837. We've had a land commissioner since 1837. We've only had a governor since 1846. The first commissioner was a guy named John Borden, who was appointed primarily because he failed to attend the meeting. And we have a wonderful letter in our archives that says, "Dear John, we caucused seeking a commissioner of the land office. You weren't there, we pick you, we hope you accept. Sam Houston." It was kind of a thankless task at the outset. There was no money. Texas was broke, literally, figuratively. We were cash poor and land rich. Our domain at that time was about 212 million acres. Our panhandle went all the way into Wyoming. The western boundary was the Rio Grande as it traversed New Mexico. and we had very little assets. We had a lot of balls in the air and not much resources to take care of that. In 1850, we sold our panhandle, paid off our debt, and became the iconic shape that is recognized around the world, and that is the state of Texas. We were kind of unique in the manner in which we entered the Union, though. And this is important when you start talking about offshore jurisdictions and sovereignties. We entered the Union by treaty between two sovereign nations. It was not a normal annexation where the United States government annexed the territory, took over the debt, and assumed ownership of all the public lands. We came in by treaty between two sovereign nations, ratified by the Congress of each of those nations. Our real estate guy in the transaction was Sam Houston. He insisted that our boundaries as a state be exactly as they were as a republic. And as had the Kingdom of Spain, the Republic of Mexico, we claimed offshore 3 marine leagues, which is 9 nautical or 10.36 statute miles. That would become very important in Texas history, but not until about 1940. In the 40s, and I don't know the exact time, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that submerged lands on coastal states did not belong to those coastal states. They belonged to the United States government. This was primarily instigated by, well, in part instigated anyway, by oil and gas companies that were looking at exploring and producing oil, and the federal royalty was really cheap, and the state royalties were not. So anyway, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Texas did not own the 3 Marine League, nor did any other coastal state own any submerged lands. Other coastal states claimed 1 league or 3 nautical miles, and this decision was not well received in Texas. There were secession conventions held around the state, led by a land commissioner at the time named Bascom Giles, who has the dubious distinction of being the only statewide elected official to leave from serving the people of Texas and to go to Huntsville to serve time for land fraud. The other participant in that discussion, and it was a very vocal participant, was a state senator. His name was Alan Shivers. Alan Shivers essentially became kind of a one-note Johnny. He was very, very, very vocal in trying to recover the tidelands, as it was called. And I can remember this dispute because it lasted from the 40s up until the early 60s. I can remember my parents angrily talking about the tidelands. I'm 64 years old, and I can remember them talking about it. It was the #1 issue in Texas in the late 40s and early 50s. Legislation passed the Congress to restore the tidelands to Texas. It was vetoed by Truman, or either FDR and Harry Truman. I'm not sure. I know it was one of those, probably both. We weren't doing very well. So in 1948, we elected a governor named Buford H. Jester, and a lieutenant governor, Alan Shivers, the guy that's been the advocate for recovery of the tidelands. Jester, that's a real person. I mean, he went to the University of Texas in here, Jester Hall. He was a regent at UT. He had been a railroad commissioner, and he was kind of an interesting guy. He moved in the mansion and moved in without his family. They remained in Corsicana. And it was widely known, but not reported, that the governor had a girlfriend substantially younger than he. And she traveled with him with great frequency. And in 1949, on a train trip, they all traveled by train back then, during an episode of intense physical activity is the best way to describe it, the governor had a heart attack and died on the train. The train stopped. You may be wondering what this has to do with the tidelands, but I'm going to get there. The train stopped en route after the governor's untimely but interesting demise. The young lady was driven back to Austin. The train proceeded to Houston, where the governor's body was discovered by a guy named Frank Hamer, H-A-M-E-R, also pronounced as Hammer, was a retired Texas Ranger and the same Ranger that had ambushed Bonnie and Clyde in Livonia, Louisiana in the 1930s. As a result of the governor's untimely demise, Alan Shivers was elevated to governor. He ran in his own right in 1950, and terms were 2 years back then. In 52, he's on the ballot again. And of course, 52 was a presidential election year. And of course, everyone in Texas was a member of the Democratic Party. And of course, the governor was going to lead the Texas delegation to the Democratic National Convention. And of course, was going to support the nomination of Adlai Stevenson, who was the obvious winner at that time. Well, Alan Shivers, did something that's rather rare in a moment of political courage. He calls up Adlai and says, will you support and not veto the bill to restore the tidelands to Texas? And Stevenson said, no, I'll veto that bill. Well, then Shivers talks to Dwight Eisenhower, the Republican nominee, asking the same question. Eisenhower says, yes, I will sign the bill because the federal government has entirely too much power and wealth, and that was a deal. It was a sovereign treaty. It was between two sovereign nations ratified by the Congress of both, and that should be the law of the land. Alan Shivers then endorsed, the Democratic governor of Texas endorsed the Republican nominee for president, Dwight Eisenhower. Eisenhower carried Texas. I believe it was the first time since Reconstruction. And in 1953, in his first year of office, signed the legislation that restored the tidelands to Texas, and all of that occurred because of a little train ride that did not go according to plan. It was still an issue up until the 60s because a subsequent U.S. Attorney General went back to court to try to overturn the legislation. But nonetheless, I think about 1962, somewhere in the early 60s, it was finally adjudicated, and Texas now owns 2.5 million acres of submerged land in the Gulf of Mexico out to 9 nautical miles. That puts us unique among coastal states. Not completely unique, because in that litigation, Florida ended up with a similar 3-league, 9 nautical mile sovereignty on the west coast of Florida, but not the east coast. I assume that was negotiated somehow. Of course, Florida has no production and has been catatonically opposed to it all along. But Texas does have a production. Right now, we have about 4,800 wells that have been drilled in state waters over time. That they've either ended up in production or dry holes. We currently have about, 400 of those wells are producing in state waters. All the state waters are maximum depth of 90 feet. We have a shallow gradient going into the Gulf of Mexico, unlike the Mississippi Delta, where it gets deep fairly quick, and where you have the Macondo well in very, very deep water. We have about 400 wells that are currently producing. 4,800 have been drilled. And right now, though, with the cost of natural gas being down around $4 an MMBTU, there's not a lot of interest in the Gulf of Mexico because most of that production is natural gas. I think we only have 2 wells currently drilling in the Gulf. One, I believe, is in Sabine Lake, and one is in the Gulf of Mexico offshore, all of it in shallow waters. The Land Office is the primary state agency responsible for oil spill cleanup. In the late 80s, 1980s, and 1990, maybe 1991, I don't exactly recall, there were 2 major oil spills in the Gulf of Mexico. Actually, one was the Megaboard tanker fire off of Freeport, Galveston area, and then the other one was in Galveston Bay, which was a barge and tanker collision that spilled a tremendous amount of oil. The state response was not very well organized. We had multiple state agencies involved. No one was really in charge. No one was the go-to agency, along with the federal agency, of course, which is the Coast Guard, for that oil spill cleanup. So in 1991, the Texas legislature passed the Oil Spill Prevention and Response Act and made the Texas General Land Office, as the custodian of the coast, responsible for maintaining the Oil Spill Response Division for the state of Texas. We currently have 68 full-time equivalent FTE employees. We have 5 pre-positioned locations on the Texas Gulf Coast, from Nederland, LaPorte, Port Lavaca, Corpus Christi, and Brownsville. We have boats, 4-wheelers, booms. We have all of that first response equipment. We have command trailers with multiple frequency radios. We have wildlife rehabilitation trailers. And during the recent spill, we sent equipment to Louisiana and personnel to Louisiana, Mississippi to help with the cleanup. I'm proud to say, and of course I had nothing to do with it, but I'll take credit anyway, being on the ballot every once in a while in the state, that Texas has the best oil spill response division in the United States. It is funded by an assessment on every barrel of oil that transships in a Texas port, 1.3 cents per barrel. That funding, or that assessment, is suspended when the fund reaches a certain level. I can't remember what it is. 40 million, I think, and then it's reinstituted when the fund goes down to that level. We're not responsible, though, financially for cleanup. The responsible party, the RP, is the one that pays for the cleanup. In the most recent spill, BP reimbursed us within about 30 days for all of our expenses, which frankly were kind of minimal. We were fortunate in that the currents and the winds and the location of that spill put extremely little verified BP product on Texas beaches. I think the total volume was in one roll-off box, and most of that was sand and seaweed. But it's a bigger picture than that when you start talking about impacts. The Gulf of Mexico, and I'm talking to people that know this better than I, is a ecosystem, and all of those states that boundary on the Gulf of Mexico are affected by what occurs. Now, even though we didn't have oil in the marshes, even though we didn't have oil in Galveston Bay or on the beaches, it was barely measurable. It affects what happens in Texas. Our industries, but particularly the commercial fishing industries that are headquartered, and for example, there's 2 or 3 oyster businesses located along Galveston Bay that have leases in Louisiana, Mississippi, or shrimp fleet. It affects all of us. So we can't look upon it and say, well, Texas wasn't impacted, so therefore we don't have a dog in the hunt. We do have a dog in the hunt. We are participating in the after-action activities, if you will, the Gulf of Mexico, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment, 3 state agencies, Texas Parks and Wildlife, Texas General Land Office, and Texas Commission on Environmental Quality. We are submitting projects and that we hope some of them might be funded. And it's interesting, though, when we start talking about oil spills, folks over in, say, Florida think of themselves as being immune because they don't allow that nasty old evil production and exploration in the Gulf. Well, that's simply not true, as they found out. Although it's also illustrative to recognize that when you have a hazard in the Gulf of Mexico and your primary economic driver in your community is tourism, you don't want to get on a beach with CNN and talk about what a calamity it is, which is exactly what happened in Florida, and it turned out not to be the calamity that they made it out to be. And as a result, all those tourists canceled their trips to Panhandle of Florida, and many of them came to Texas. But our responsibility for cleanup, nonetheless, is there. The transportation, though, almost all spills, there is actually a different spelling, those words, almost all spills are transportation related. So when Florida thinks of themselves as immune, as they clearly are not, as you've seen last summer, they can only be immune if you don't use petroleum products. If you don't participate in bulk transport, whether that's by tanker, whether that's by barge, whether that's by pipeline, whatever, you are in the hunt for oil spill catastrophe. The vast majority are transportation related. Very, very, very few are related to exploration and production. The 2 obvious notable exceptions were, the Deepwater Horizon, and then back in 1979, the Ixtoc spill down off the Yucatan coast, which severely impacted Texas beaches on the lower Texas coast. But the impact was a little different because the material was extremely viscous and went ashore as tar balls that were not very soluble and were easy to clean up. But transportation is where that occurs. You go back to the Exxon Valdez spill, I believe that was in 1989, and then the Congress got involved and said we need to take a look at what we can do to make this better, prevent it from happening again. They passed the Oil Pollution Act of 1990, but that was transportation centric, if you will. It was about, double hull tankers. There are no more single hull tankers operating in U.S. waters, to my knowledge. If they are, I don't know how that's happening, or maybe they're lightering or something. So we focused on oil spills as it relates to transportation. Maybe it's time now to focus on oil spills as it relates to exploration and production. But in doing so, we need to be very careful. No knee-jerk is necessary. No just arbitrary shutting down E&P in the Gulf of Mexico to make things safer. That's not what we want to be doing. We put a I'm not quite sure where we are. Do we have a moratorium or don't we have a moratorium? I think the moratorium has officially been lifted, but there have been no leases issued in the Deepwater Gulf. So in effect, we have a moratorium. Now, I'm told that can't remember the gentleman's name that's head of BOMRE, whatever you call it, Bomri, some call it Bummer. I'm not sure what you call it, but he has said recently that he would be very surprised if there were no permits issued by May, and that really is good news. We also have to put this in historical perspective. The first documented oil spill in Texas occurred in 1543. When some Spanish explorers, I think they were part of Cabeza de Vaca's exploration, washed ashore on the upper Texas coast near High Island and found pools of oil right there on the beach and in the waters. That was a natural seep on land. Similar to the natural seep, if you remember the Beverly Hillbillies, when Jed Clampett fires his musket and bubbling crude comes up, that was a natural seep on land. Natural seeps have all been explored and produced on land, but they still exist in the Gulf of Mexico. And that is a major source of tar balls. Long tradition in Texas of tar balls. I grew up going to the beach with my mama had a bottle of baby oil to wipe it off my feet. But I have to tell you, there are fewer and fewer tar balls in Texas. Oil spills are still in existence in spite of the fact that we have an oil spill division that's very focused on prevention. Still about 800 spills a year, just like there were in 1990. The difference is back then they were measured in tens of thousands of barrels, and today they're usually measured in less than a barrel. So I think we're close to the end of my session. I look forward to participating in the Q&A, and thank you for having me here this morning to say a few words.
I'm next. As I informed you before, my name is Ron Sass. I'm here at Rice University. I was here at Rice University. I retired in 2003 for the first time. Retired again in 2005, and I think again in 2007, and once more in 2010, and here I'm back again. So you'll have to excuse me for doing this. But anyway, I am currently a member of a research group called SPEED here at Rice and at other universities. We're cooperating to look at the impact of hurricanes on the Gulf Coast of Texas and to see what kind of mitigation factors we can put together with respect to that. One of the things we were looking at is the idea of land use. The hurricane surge from Ike came ashore about 25 miles. And therefore, that 25 miles may be considered to be a rather hazardous zone to grow people in. And we're looking for other ways of utilizing that. And one of the ways we're looking at is the idea of a national recreational area along this part of the coast. The idea of a national recreation area here is one that would try or succeed in establishing a way of keeping our wetlands intact, which primarily means no people. Now those wetlands stand for an extensive inland area, and consequently, because they are on the coast, could be impacted by an oil spill. So one of the things we're looking at is what's the probability or what's the chance that the upper Texas coast will be impacted by an oil spill. And what I would like to do this morning, if I can manage to work this thing, is to give you a little idea, where do I point this thing, at the currents that exist in the Gulf of Mexico and how they might impact the Texas coast. And we see here that the Gulf of Mexico is a rather isolated cul-de-sac, somewhat like the Mediterranean Sea, except that we have two openings and the Mediterranean only has one. Now that's a major difference. We're separated from the Caribbean Sea by the Yucatan Strait, which is 2,000 meters deep. Now the deepest part of the Gulf of Mexico is 3,600 meters. So there is a bottom area there that is not necessarily directly impacted by the incoming current from the Yucatan Peninsula. The waters leave up above that on the Straits of Florida, and that's only 800 meters deep. Now, in spite of that, what happens in the interim is the water comes into the Gulf of Mexico and develops what we all know as the loop current. And the loop current then runs back out, and because of the difference in the relative volumes per second that can go past this at a given velocity, the loop current can change in shape. And it expands and contracts, and as it expands and contracts. And as it does, it can spin off little elements, loops, from the loop current. The question is, what do they do, and where do they go, and how do they affect the Texas Gulf Coast? So I'd like to look at that. What we might notice if we look at the Gulf of Mexico itself is what we've heard about all morning, and that is that there is a shelf. And on the Texas Gulf Coast, that shelf is fairly extensive and ranges down to about 200 meters in depth. The winds along that shelf are primarily out of the southeast and drive the water in this direction and down the coast. Consequently, there's another current that's coming up in this way from Mexico, and the shelf being rather narrow here has somewhat different characteristics than ours up here. But if we look at that coastal area and see just exactly what might be happening, that's called the latex shelf by most people, Louisiana, Texas, and we share it with Louisiana. And it's dynamically isolated, I think, from the deep ocean currents. It's influenced by freshwater discharge from the Mississippi, and I'd like to look at that. It's currently wind-driven, and since the wind is coming out of the southeast, that is a counterclockwise or cyclonic current, wind velocity driving the ocean currents in that direction. Now, if it's going down the coast, it has to do something when it gets there. And what it does is turn around and come back. And it turns around and comes back on the shelf. And so we get a current that starts proximally over here by the Mississippi River and comes around here about halfway down the state of Texas and then loops back. Might come a little lower. And another one comes up this way and does essentially the same thing because the wind is driving at from the southeast up the coast here. They meet at about the middle of Laguna Madre. And if you know Laguna Madre, it's separated by a sand sheet from North Laguna Madre and South Laguna Madre. And that sand sheet was deposited there by these two conflicting currents coming together at that point and dropping their sand and silt. So it's fairly well established what that's doing. But it doesn't do the same thing all the time. And looking at it a little bit more in detail first, what I've got here is the salt concentration in that water, not salt, oxygen concentration in that water. And oxygen saturates water at about 8 milligrams per liter, and that is this darkest area here. So you see right by the Mississippi River opening there, the delta, you have pretty much saturated, oxygen-saturated water. Oh, excuse me, I got that completely backwards. That's oxygen-free water. And as the water goes down this way, it remains deprived in oxygen. You get the dead zone coming through there. But my point is that that dead zone is defined by the shelf up to about the 200-meter mark, which indicates that the Mississippi flow is coming primarily in this direction. In doing that, it's mixing with other waters that are coming in from the Gulf of Mexico here and is causing a change in salinity. So again, looking at salinity, and the graph over on the opposite side goes from about 30 parts per million, 30 up to about 37, 30 parts per thousand, I mean, up to about 37. So this area right here is at about 30. And this area out here is about 36, which would indicate that if there's a mixing of fresh and salt water along this coastal area here, that about 1/6 of that water should be fresh and 5/6 of it ought to be from the Gulf of Mexico in general. And that's about exactly what happens. The current coming out of the Mississippi River is about 1/10 of a million cubic meters per second. A third drop, 1/10 of a third drop, and this current going along here is about 6/10. So it's not simply the Mississippi River waters that come along here, but they do mix with Gulf of Mexico waters. But what the salinity is telling us is that this area is fairly isolated from the rest of the Gulf of Mexico. And the isolation is the edge of the shelf out here. If we look at surface temperature, we see the same thing. We have a rather low temperature area here, rather high temperature area. The water coming in down here through the Straits of the Yucatan is quite warm, coming from the Caribbean Ocean down there, Caribbean Sea. And it's coming in, and you can see vestiges of the upper loop here. But in this case, the loop really is very, very short and goes back out here. But there's also warm water over here, and that's where those loops come in. Looking at currents, we see the same sort of thing. We see the major currents in the deep water areas, minor currents along the coast. They're not in any particular direction, although there is a geostropic gyre that does move around the whole of the deep ocean area of the Gulf of Mexico. And those currents are different from the loop current, really. But what they are steering currents for these little loops that come off of the loop current. So looking then at the shelf current, those have been measured. And these diagrams here go out to about what is that? 20 meters? Yeah, they go out to about 20 meters deep. So we're looking right along the coast, and the vectors tell you the directions of the flow along that inner area there. And you can see that it runs from the north up here around the corner down towards the southwest. In the fall, in the winter, they're doing the same thing. In the spring, they're doing the same thing. And in the summer, they get a little bit befuddled. So if we're looking at the probability of an oil spill from some shelf oil well, if it happens not in the summer, what we're going to get along the Texas coast would be oil that's coming from Louisiana over here down towards High Island, let's say, and below. On the other hand, if it happens in the summer, chances are we don't quite know what oil spill will affect this coastal line. It could be, it's variable because the wind direction is variable so much in the summertime. Now if we look at the deep circulation, the general circulation, as I say, is geostrophic or clockwise, which is different from the shelf current. Shelf current's going counterclockwise, deep current's going clockwise. So they meet at the shelf edge and come into two lobes. The main components are the loop current and their related eddies, which come off the loop current. And the near surface circulation in the deep regions is dominated by this energetic loop current. Now, drift buoy data are kind of interesting. And what the drift buoy data do is give us an idea of what's going on out here with respect to these loop current eddies. Now, here's one other look at it, and this is a temperature map. And you can see in this temperature map, the loop current is fairly well developed. And over here is one of the eddies. Now, where is that eddy going? It's generally drifting west. But if you take a really close look at those eddies, as they drift west, they loop. And here are several tracks where the drifting buoys have been plotted about every 3 or 4 days, and you can see this general drift, and then back around as you go through this geostrophic extra current that's hitting over the whole area here. And my point, though, is that at no time really do these impact the shelf up here. So in general, I would say that a deep water spill has little chance of impacting the Texas coast. That the Texas coast would have problems with are primarily shelf spills that occur over here. Here's a composite picture from 1978 to 2003 of all of these data that were taken from the various drift buoys. Not that many in the Gulf of Mexico, but you can see that this area up here was invaded once, but very, very seldom. The major drift currents come over here and affect the loop current and sort of sweep back out over Florida here. You remember during the Macondo spill that we looked at loop currents and we looked at currents, we looked at all of these pictures day after day after day, and it was very erratic what the oil spill was doing. And that's up in this region right here, which is very erratic as far as the currents are concerned. So, we've mentioned the vulnerability. And what are we vulnerable from? We've seen this picture more or less a lot of times, once again this morning. And Amy says, I got 5 minutes left. So the yellow ones are oil wells and oil leases primarily. These are not wells particularly, but they're oil leases, which include wells that have been capped, wells that are dead, wells that are being bored, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at least there's a large concentration here. And this is the 1,000-meter mark here. And then this is the deep water area out here. So it would be primarily these wells that we're interested in and looking at and seeing how they would affect the Gulf Coast. Well, as has been pointed out by Dr. Jerry Patterson, there have been some major spills, not all of which were from oil wells. There are also transportational spills. The major 7 of them include 2 oil wells, Vickstock, which has been mentioned, and the Deepwater Horizon, these 2. There have been 4 transport and barge spills, and the 7th one was really a hurricane. That's Ike there. Now, which of those would we expect to have impacted the coast over here? Well, not the Deepwater, not Ocean 255 over here, which happened in Tampa Bay, actually. Vickstock would be running up this way, but would run into a countercurrent coming down this way, and impacted actually the Texas Gulf Coast for about 150 miles. There is a picture of the Deepwater Horizon. We don't see that coming on the coast. There's Vickstock. It traveled 800 miles north from where it was, as we predict from the currents. 150 of that along the coast of Texas up to about Aransas, which does not hit our upper coast. Hurricane Katrina was primarily inland, no problem there. The Burma agate was very close to us. It was southeast of Galveston, and the oil traveled there more than 200 miles, going down the Matagorda Peninsula and Padre Island, which is exactly where the currents would be taking it. The Megaborg was at about the same location, but the Megaborg was in the summertime, and the oil went not south like we might expect under normal circumstances, but went north and northwest. And finally, the Ocean 255 was way over in Florida, and we had no reason to worry about that. The area I'm interested in is this one right here, that is our projected area for our recreational facility. And the browner areas here are wetlands. Notice that there's a barrier island going along the whole area here. Now that barrier island, if oil does come in this direction, that barrier island is going to be impacted primarily. And if we can block off that opening here, which is the straits into the Houston Ship Channel, the Bolivar Strait, and San Luis Pass down here, then I think we can keep our wetlands intact and not be impacted by an oil spill. Now that does not say that the megafauna coming around this area will not be impacted. It's not saying that the beach area will not be impacted, but it's saying we can protect the wetlands. And we can do that, as I said, by putting a gate here and a gate down here. Now, how we build that gate, I don't have an answer for that yet. I would like to see something more kind of semi-permanent there that could be put into place very rapidly. It wouldn't have to be large, wouldn't have to be high. I would like to see it go down into the water, because these booms that have been put down after the last spill, a lot of oil went underneath the booms as well as over the top of it. So that would be impractical for me. In order to protect for hurricanes, there's a proposal that this gate be 25 feet high, because the surge that we're going to protect for is a 25-foot surge. So somewhere in between that, there will be a solution to this, and a solution which allow us to say that our Texas marsh system can be protected and can be a viable national recreational area. And I thank you very much. Now our next speaker is going to tell me that I'm all wet and that the marshland is affected. And her name is Linda Bowie, and she's a professor at the LSU in entomology. Worries mainly about ants, but I think has now expanded her study to a broader range of little critters and how they're affected by stress by things like hurricanes and by oil spills. Linda?
Okay, let's see. You still can't see me any better, but you'll be able to hear me better. Okay, well, first of all, since people seem to be a little afraid of what I'm going to say, I want to tell you where I'm coming from before I talk about the marsh that I love so much and have watched being impacted. First of all, I'm an independent scientist, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that at the end of my talk, about the struggle with somebody who didn't work for BP in part of their initial rush to hire scientists. And then also, I don't work for the NRDA process, as we call it, the Natural Resources Damage Assessment. And so I'm somebody who's been working in Louisiana for 12 years and done surveys all over the south of Louisiana, and I'm going to talk about some of the work I did. But before I talk about my science and what's happening with the marshes and show you about some of the wonderful ecology of the marsh, I want to address something. It's kind of what I would say maybe the elephant in the room is what's an ecologist doing here at an energy forum. And I want to say a couple things about the moratorium. In Louisiana, it has been deeply affected by the moratorium. And some of the people that have been deeply affected were my friends. They're people who have worked in oil and gas, and when they're not out working, they're fishing. And they're often both working in the oil industry and the commercial fishermen. And this has really affected their livelihoods, and the moratorium has affected many people's livelihoods. Now, you'd think I'd come into this room with being, you know, as an ecologist, that I'm pro-moratorium. But what I want to tell you is that I liken it to an experience I think we've all had, is when you were in elementary school and there were a couple kids that were bad, and the teacher punished the whole classroom. we've all been there and been frustrated because we were not the people who participated in the bad behavior. And you'd think that, people who have experienced that they wouldn't turn around and do this to an entire industry. And I feel really, obviously, very strongly about that. The other thing is we can look at, I think kids' behavior is very organic. I have a child, I spend a lot of time watching her behavior. And if you notice that when there's a group of kids and one child is especially bad and they get punished, how angelic the behavior of all the other kids in that area become. And I think there's something that can be learned from this, and I hope that the people who are making decisions are able to, take away from my comments, I hope they're listening, is that punish the people who make the mistakes and who had lax rules and took shortcuts, but don't punish the whole industry. So I want to tell you, learn something from, human behavior and that. Another thing about human behavior I want to comment on is at the beginning we've all looked at this Oil Spill Commission report that came out January 12th, and some people I'm sure in this room have interacted with the Oil Spill Commission, President's Oil Spill Commission. Well, in looking at that document, the other thing that I've done is I've gone back and I looked at the two prior Oil Spill Commission reports. There was multiple reports from the 1969 Santa Barbara spill, and there is a report that's 44 pages long with some appendices for the 1989 Exxon Valdez spill. And if you take away the identifying characteristics of the geographic location and some of the other things, they read pretty much the same. And so I want to highlight that, and in fact, hopefully that will be an article that I'll write that'll be in the national media in the next few weeks. I want to highlight that we need to learn something, and that's one of the reasons why I'm happy to be here, because I want to be a part of moving forward. And it's not just doing the same thing that we've done before, punishing all the children in the classroom for a few people's behavior, or doing, saying the same rhetoric from the oil spill commissions. Now, given that, I'd like to talk to you as leaders in the community, and I'd like to bring you, we've looked at some really large overviews, and I'm going to talk really specifically about the marshes, and I'm going to talk about my research. And another question you might have in your mind is, what's an entomologist doing here at an energy forum? And, doesn't she study bugs? Yeah, I do. And you know what? When I first got involved in this after the oil spill, and we had actually quite a large meeting at LSU, I stood up and everybody had their eyes half closed because, what's an entomologist doing here? And then I connected it to my insects are the food for the frogs, fish, and birds. And they're ultimately connected to the human health. And so people's eyes flew open. And then, that's where I fit in this marsh research. And I'm going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about the ecology of the area. I'm going to talk to you about what I've done. We're going to talk to you about some preliminary results and where we're going in the future. And I hope to then talk a little bit about policy at the end. So this person who's standing here, his name's Xuan. I talk about him a lot. He's out, as I call it, he's outstanding in his field. He came from China to study with me because I've studied hurricanes and the fact I'm a disturbance ecologist, and hurricanes are a pretty big disturbance in Louisiana. I also work in the forest and work on human disturbance in forested ecosystems, but I've fallen in love with the marsh also. And so he came and, he was working on the ecosystem. He works in the coastal dunes and also in the salt marsh, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And I want to talk to you a little bit about what we were looking at before Macondo. Of course, I have to have pictures of ants in here because they're my very favorite things ever. But what we found is, I want to tell you some of the really intricacy things about the marsh. So these ants that you have here are called acrobat ants, and these acrobat ants actually live inside the hollow stems of marsh grass. So the cordgrass, the Spartina alterniflora, And we were trying to figure out exactly where these ants fit in the food web, and we were trying to answer some questions about what happens when storm surge from hurricanes comes in. What, you know, these ants are living in these plants, and what is going on with the ecosystem. So we were trying to build some food webs and some ecosystem dynamics using ants as a model. Okay, you're wondering, what does that have anything to do with energy? Well, I'll get to that in a minute. And so hurricanes and storm surge, and you know, so we work in the field, we work in the lab, we simulate storm surges in the lab, and we have all kinds of fun playing games with ecology. So Schwann came, and he's been focused on this idea I had about what these ants are doing, and he actually has a transect that runs from along the coastal dunes from Florida all the way to Texas. So we've invaded Texas with our research too. And he was asking questions about disturbance and this idea that of a subset model that whether the ants are unique to the habitat or whether they're actually a subset of more complex inland habitats. And so he got started, and he was very excited, and then Macondo well disaster happened, and we're still trying to figure out how he's going to continue his research, but we have some ideas. So that brings me to what I'm going to talk about today. We're going to talk a little bit about the marsh ecology and the aftermath of the spill. We've seen several maps. Today we're going to focus on Louisiana. Our sampling areas for the purpose of our post-Macondo work in the marshes is in this area here, and in here, and over here, okay? And so this is the border of Louisiana, Mississippi, and this is the border of Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. And as you know, and you've probably seen all kinds of footage about how heavily impacted our marshes are, Robert Barnum, our Director of Wildlife and Fisheries, is saying that we still have 100 miles of marshes that are impacted. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means in a minute. Okay, so this is kind of a zoomed in look. We have 90 sites. We were able to get to these sites before oil made landfall in the areas. We have areas where there has been no oil detected, and we have areas that are heavily oiled. One of the areas, we zoom in a little bit more, in Barataria Bay, you've seen this in the news. This is an IRMA map. We are developing a better data set than this, but the blue areas are where there has been no detected oil. The light green is where it's lightly oiled, and it gets darker orange, moderate oil, red, heavy oil. And probably what you saw, National Geographic went out about a month ago at low tide. And then about a week later, the national media came out to bait Jimmy, and you've probably seen all those images. So if you want to know where those were from, they're from right there, and you'll see some more of those today. We have several sampling sites from Bay San Juan all the way up into Bay Wilkinson. And of course, we extend from the Brenton Sound all the way to Terrebonne. So let me talk a little bit about what encompasses this ecosystem. This is Max, who works in my lab. He's looking for marsh mussels. And what we did is, there's many people at LSU who have been working in the marsh, and so I was working relatively independently before the Macondo explosion. And so we actually formed a loose consortium of professors, and we work with Laurie Anderson, who studies mollusks, so that's the littorina, the marsh mussels, and the oysters. So our work is done in adjacent open waters and then in the marsh areas. And my focus is the insects, and I'll talk about that more in just a minute. We have people who are looking at the plants, looking at biomass, looking at the changes in the sulfur concentrations in the leaves. This is how plants respond to stress. We also have people looking at microbial communities within the open areas and in the marsh soils. So one of my collaborators is Gene Turner, and if you've ever done any work in marsh or diversions, you know who Gene Turner is. And this is an example of that marsh grass I was talking about, the Spartina. This is a monoculture. But of course, there's also juncus and other black mangroves in other areas of the marsh. And so, you know, we basically are working, most of the time, we're working within about 20 meters of the edge. And, but we have plans to go further in, and you'll find out why in just a minute. Okay, so after the oil hit, one of the comments I might make is I think we need to rethink booms. They were very ineffective in many areas, and in many areas they did save the area. But so this is an area where there was no boom. This picture was taken in September. This was at a time where there was still, September 9th and 10th, some fresh oil still was coming in. And the areas were boomed off about 10 meters to 15 meters away from the edge of the marsh. But actually in some areas, after Hurricane or Tropical Storm Alex, it was when it came ashore in Louisiana, it pushed the boom up into here. But one of the things I want to point out is, of course, this is an oiled marsh, but you can see that there's a rack here, which is just, I don't know, it's rack. It's just debris. It's usually, you know, dead marsh grass and other things. And what happened is when the oil came in, it tamped down the marsh grass, and when the marsh grass normally is standing up on the edge, it offers some protection, and the oil came in, and our concern is now further storm surge coming in and further damaging the marsh. So, but you think it's like, well, that's only like, you know, 10 meters from the edge. That's really not that big of a deal. So we'll talk about that in just a minute. So this group of people that we started to started to work, we have this diagram. Here's our boat at the edge of the marsh. Here's the marsh edge. This is open water. And this we basically went in and we spent about an hour at each of these sites doing some very intensive sampling. Like I said, we came in 20 meters. So here's the insect sweep. Okay, this is the most important thing because I'm going to talk about the insects. And then we also did one parallel to the shore. And I'm going to tell you, at no point did we actually do any sampling in an oiled area. We were always in the healthy marsh adjacent to the oiled areas. So, and we also did a clip plot, 2 clip plots where we looked at plant biomass and then insects, and I'll get to that in just a minute. And then there's lots of other sampling for foraminifera, dinoflagellates. We looked at pore water. We looked at surface sediments. We also took oil samples for stressors, oil dispersants, inland and at the edge. And if you'd like more information about this project, I have a poster. I have a few copies of it if you're interested in hearing more about it and seeing more diagrams. Okay, so the one thing I'd like to, here's a good picture of that rack that comes in. And so we have the marsh grass that's laid down by the oil and the rack that comes in, and then the healthy marsh here. And so when we came in to do our samplings in an oil marsh, we actually didn't start our research until we saw areas that didn't appear to have any green grass, that did have green marsh grass. Okay, this is one of my friends just went about a week ago and took some pictures in Barataria Bay, and this is what it looks like today. The good news is we have some little sprigs of marsh grass that are growing. But if we look really closely, so many of you know that all the different lengths of carbons that are involved in hydrocarbons, and I want to point out, so this is mud, you know, typical, but this here are those asphaltenes and the paraffins, those really long carbon chains in oil that are still present in the marsh, and we don't know what impact those are going to have, if any. And I just wanted to point that out. But one of the impacts that's really obvious and that Gene Turner is measuring, but it's most obvious, is we're losing the protection at the edge of the marsh. And so there's usually actually almost a little berm at the edge of the marsh. And we don't know the reason why, or Gene Turner hasn't shared the reason why with me, whether it's that we're losing biomass of the roots or the plants are dying or exactly what's going on, but you can literally watch the edge of the marsh drop off. into the Gulf, and this, of course, is distressing because of what people have pointed out before is the acceleration of land loss. So why are insects? I'm going to remind you, it's like my mantra that they're food for frogs, fish, and birds. And I want to point out that they're really easy to sample. So this is Max. He's out there sampling. Like I said, he's in an oiled marsh. You can tell by how he's dressed. He's used this ultra high-tech method that's been used for like 100 years in collecting insects. It's an insect net. You know, you see people with their, nerd entomologists with their insect nets. Yeah, that's us. Okay. So, and then we clip a plot. We just cut the plants. And so I said it's easy to sample. Well, it's not easy when we get it back into the lab. So this is some of my crew, and literally, so here's our clip plot, and they're literally going through each one of these, sorting out, cutting open the stems, and dumping out all the insects. And then they also are going through that net, and that net becomes filled with the littorine of the snails, and also grass, and all kinds of things. So they sort through that and find insects. So the interesting thing is people want to know, oh, what species are these, like me? But you know what? You don't care, and neither do the frogs, fish, and birds, because all they really care about is, like, there's a lot of really small ones, which we're probably going to sort in 10 years. And we're really interested in these. These are little seed bugs. They're really important. They feed on the seed heads of the Spartina. And crickets and grasshoppers. Grasshoppers eat the tops of the marsh grass and keep it from poking you in the eye when you walk through it, the juncus. If you've ever walked through a marsh, you know that that's not a pleasant experience. Okay, so we asked 2 questions. We asked a question about diversity, and we're asking questions about abundance. Now, first thing is, we have species loss. Now, if you had told me in last April 20th, I actually talked to a former student who called me and said, hey, this is going to be bigger than you can ever imagine, and it's going to affect your research. If you had told me I'd be standing here today telling you that we're looking at species loss within the year of insects, I would have told you were crazy. I was shocked to see this. It doesn't mean it's permanent, but we're going to be able to ask questions about how long it takes for these insects to move back in or repopulate the area. Okay, and this is very preliminary data. I'm still sorting through tons and tons of samples. But so when I say species lost, typically when we go to an unoiled marsh, and remember I told you we had samples from before oil hit landfall, we had typically 15 species of different creatures. And now we have an average of about 6. Woo. Okay. So remember I told you about these green seed bugs? They're hugely numerous, and we have, again, depression of the numbers of these insects, and this is abundance. Now this is really important because these little guys are up there for the marsh wrens and other insect-eating creatures like frogs and the marsh wrens, and they are radically suppressed. These are contemporaneous data, so in unoiled marshes, we had huge numbers of them, and they were suppressed down to from 147 to about 22. And so we don't know why this happened. We are in the process of experimenting with some oil and with some dispersant. I don't think it's dispersant, but I have to not rule that out. We have a suppression of spiders, and interesting, it's the largest spiders that are affected, and so we're investigating that. And so this is, and I could go through bees, and I could go through flies, and it's the same thing. Okay, so I told you we're continuing to look forward to that. We have we've pulled some people in from who work on birds, and we've made our consortium bigger. It started out as 10 people, now it's 23 people from 13 institutions. And we are going after a long-term research project associated with this. Okay, of course I can't just go out and do research and be quiet because I have a lot to say about this. And so in The Scientist, which is a trade magazine for the life scientists, I published an article called Oil Stain on Science. And in a different vein, but still somewhat similar, I published an op-ed in the New York Times and the International Herald Tribune, and it ended up getting syndicated. It went all around the world, called The Gulf Science Blackout. And it was talking about the impact of the oil spill on independent research and the fact that my student and I were blocked from getting to these areas because the area was being policed, and only BP scientists and NERDA scientists were allowed into some of these areas. We actually got into the areas before they were shut down in many places. And the other issue that I addressed is the lack of money for independent scientists. And fortunately for the National Science Foundation, they came through with some money, and now the money has slowly been trickling through. I am optimistic about the Gulf Research Initiative through Gulf of Mexico Alliance, but we were supposed to get the RFP on December 1st, and which means the request for proposals. It's a 50-page proposal, and we have not gotten it yet, and we are waiting. It is February now. The current state of grants available for people like me is pathetic. I've written about 3 times as many grants as normal. About 80% of them are getting funded, so we are able to continue. But I appreciate the oil industry, in fact, BP, and the fact that they set up this independent money, and that it's going to, but I think we need to take it further. And I think that there needs to be a panel, and I actually called in the New York Times article for it to be run through the National Science Foundation, of experts, of ecologists and subsistence experts and diversion experts, and I mean everything you can think of, for people to be on call for a natural and technological disaster so that it can be independently assessed outside of the courts and the litigation, and so that we can learn from this and move forward. And I'm happy to bring this idea to y'all because I think some of the strong ideas that have come out of this disaster have come from the industry, and it's something I would open up for people to talk about. And I'd be happy to talk to more people about it later. Thank you.
We have time for we have almost three questions, I suppose. So we need to have the very most important questions first. And it's open for discussion. There are 2 microphones you might want to use. Address your question to any particular person. I'd like to second what Linda said about freedom of research. And that is that it has to be free. Otherwise, it gets distorted. I have been practicing lately as a consultant for a legal firm, expert witness sort of thing. And I have to tell myself all the time that I've got to be impartial. And it's hard because I know what the guy wants me to say. And I know what the guy doesn't want me to say. But that's not what I'm supposed to say because I'm a scientist. So independent funding, I think, is a very important thing. And a pool, government and industry and nonprofits funding would be, I think, very appropriate in cases like this where there is a litigious aspect. Amy?
So I have a question for Dr. Thornhill. In light of the stories that we've heard, I would want to know why the government would block any scientists from coming to take a sample or do research in the wetlands.
Well, not having been there when the event actually occurred, I don't know what the circumstances were and what the actual actions were, nor what the justification was for it. As a scientist, I would say exactly the same thing, especially in the case where you've got pre-event data and you have the opportunity to see what's changed. That baseline that's been running for a significant period of time and then the signal that you get from whatever the event was is a really important piece of information to have. So as a scientist, I would say it's absolutely essential that we get back out there and we check those things. I recognize that there are significant litigation going on, and I know that people were very anxious about not interrupting the Department of Justice's case that they were developing and are still developing. And so there's a lot of issues that go outside of the sciences that, I don't have an opinion on a lot of those things, except to say that I didn't appreciate how complicated this stuff was until I took a government job. And now I just kind of shake my head that anything gets done at all. It's amazing how complicated this stuff is. So it may be, and I'll venture a guess here, that it was people trying to do the right thing and trying to actually support the process that they knew was important, but maybe they didn't understand the bigger picture. And that's what we'd like to avoid, is making sure everybody knows that the collection of signal data is just as important as the background baseline data, because we need to know what the effects were. So not a very satisfactory answer, but it's a complicated process for sure.
Thank you, Alan. We have a question over here.
I have a question on that was raised by an intersection of listening to Dr. Kemp and then Dr. Thornhill. Clearly there's been a degeneration, shall we say, of the Gulf Coast that went on for many years, and now there is a government attempt to come up with a plan for restoration, and I wondered what it meant. Restoration to what? 1920, pre-Macondo? What does restoration mean? What is Audubon's goal for restoration? And then what is Dr. Thornhill's task? What was he told to look into what he's going to restore? And so I'd like to, if I could find out from the two of them what we're talking about.
Oh, thank you for giving me the opportunity. I think restoration is a term that's confusing. It has the notion that you're going back to a previous state. I don't think that anyone thinks that the work that is necessary in Louisiana is going to take us back to a state that previously existed. It will take us to, we're hopeful, to a more sustainable condition, but it won't be the same as where we started. So we're trying to reset the system, basically, that's been where so many processes have been interrupted, particularly the nourishment of the wetlands by the river. It's been essentially severed from the river. Those are so we're trying to restore processes really more than reset the system at a more sustainable level than where it is now. Is there? I don't know if that. I guess Dr. Thornhill. It's a fundamental truth in ecology that nothing stays the same. It is constantly shifting through time. Things ebb and flow. And the idea that you can reset a system back to some previous state is a little antiquated. And I don't think there are a lot of ecologists that would actually support that view. What we want to do instead is to preserve the system's ability to adapt and change into the future, maintaining the ecological and evolutionary processes that support a resilient system that can respond to change, whether it's climate change or perturbations that we generate or hurricanes, whatever they are. We need the system to be able to respond to those. It's a bit like being a healthy human individual. If you're hit with an accident, car accident or whatever, and you've led a healthy life and you've been maintaining your systems well, you're likely to recover more quickly from your injuries, should you sustain some. Ecological systems are no different. They need all of the functioning parts, and they need them to be in a place where they're healthy and resilient. And so when we think about the idea of restoration ecology nowadays, we think more about raising the ecological function of an area, not returning it to some previous state. And ultimately the goal then is for resilience and the ability of the system to adapt and change to things that come its way. And if climate change has the sorts of impacts that we anticipate,
We need the systems to be able to adapt and change because the whole context of how they operate is going to be shifting. And the more stressors that they have to deal with, in addition to that climate change effect, it's going to mean more and more trouble for their ability to adapt and absorb those perturbations that they're going to suffer. So from the point of view of the Restoration Task Force, the idea is about returning the processes, as we just heard, into a state where they can function and operate independently without constant influx of our infusion of energy and money to keep things working. We need them to work by themselves. And raising the integrity of the ecological system such that they have the resilience to adapt. So those are the goals, not returning species X to a particular proportion of the biomass. That's a pretty outdated way of thinking about ecology. Thanks.
Are there any more burning questions? Yes, sir.
My question is for Dr. Thornhill and Dr. Hooper. Nonetheless, a very huge catastrophe, the Chernobyl disaster a quarter century ago in Soviet Union was not followed by the nuclear winter disaster that we thought at the time. All the evidence I've seen in the press suggests that the nature is actually rejuvenating in the absence of a human presence since in that area. So in the light of the Macondo disaster, how much do we really know about the planet's ability to heal just by itself? How much of the consequences of the disaster have been exaggerated by our fears? Thank you.
I can't really address the Chernobyl. I'm not an expert on the ecology of that area. I mean, I've read some stuff, but I would like to tell you that I think the jury's out on what the effect is on the marsh. I'm not going to tell you that we've dodged a bullet, and I'm also not going to tell you that, you know, the ecosystem is forever damaged. But what I can tell you is that petrochemicals, hydrocarbons are very, very common spills, as was said by another presenter. They're very common, and the ecosystem is somewhat adapted to that. It's just the size of this perturbation is unprecedented, and we don't know if the processes that took care of, you know, the natural seeps and the other oil spills that have been going on since before the 1500s, whether that is going to be able to, the community is resilient enough to be able to handle that. The marsh is very resilient. I'm in the boat of, we need to leave the marsh alone, and you know, the mayors and the parish presidents are out there in the media, you need to get out here and do something. And my group is strongly says, the marsh is going to heal itself. We don't know what it's going to look like on the other side, and we want to be there to measure it.
Yeah, so I have just two questions. So primarily for Professor Bowie, has the change in abundance of some of the bugs affected animals higher up on the food chain? I mean, are there reports of starvation of birds? And also, to put things in context, what is the magnitude of the damage from oil spills to the Gulf from all the runoff from farms in the Midwest, what is often called the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico? Thank you.
You'll have to come take my ecology class to get the whole answer to that question. You know, what I presented today with the insects is it's a snapshot, it's preliminary data. It's something, I'm not gonna, you know, I'm not a bird expert. We do have a bird expert, actually 3 of them on our team now. And that is going to be addressed, and as was said, the NERDA process is going to be ongoing for a long period of time. And I thought I was going to spend my career studying disturbance of hurricanes and four-wheelers in the forests, but it looks like it's moving more toward hydrocarbons. So I can't make an accurate statement that I would feel comfortable being out there about what, you know, maybe that, you know, when I come out there, when it starts to get warm again, all the insects will be back. but that's the Pollyanna part of me. And maybe, you know, we don't know. I can predict, I would say that there's going to be some creatures that are going to be impacted and others they're going to be very resilient. And so that's a story I hope to be able to tell in the future.
Okay, I think we're due a coffee break. If you have any more questions, we'll be around. Thank you very much.